As we are just 53 days away from the presidential election, we'll be taking a look at the polling from every single state on this map. And yes, we're actually going to look at every single state. So starting off here with the state of Washington. Right now, in the few polls conducted in Washington, Harris has an average lead of 11.3%. That may seem impressive, however, Joe Biden won the state by 19% in 2020, so that's roughly a 8% drop off if the polling is actually accurate. That's not a good outlook here for Kamala Harris. And it doesn't end there. In the state of Oregon, here right now, in the sole poll conducted, which we should take a grain of salt from, but nevertheless, Kamala Harris only leads by 5%. That is not great news when Biden won the state by 16 in 2020. So Oregon does come down as just lean Democrat. Now going to the state of California. Now in California right now, Kamala Harris has a 24% advantage. Keep in mind, she serves as a senator from the state of California before she was chosen as Joe Biden's running mate. Now, 24% may seem impressive. However, Joe Biden won the state of California in 2020 by 29.2%. While a margin in a state like California won't be super important, it could be significant in some of the down ballot races, specifically the House elections. And as you can see, Kamala Harris is not doing that well in the state of California. Now going to the next state on this map here, the state of Nevada. In the state of Nevada right now, Kamala Harris does maintain 8.6% advantage over Donald Trump. Now, polling in Nevada has historically been relatively accurate. What I mean is that the states have generally been overestimating or underestimating a candidate by roughly around 2%. Now, you might say that that means Harris has the advantage. However, that's certainly not necessarily the case. Harris only leads by 0.6%, and given the fact that the margin of error is roughly 4 to 5%, this still means that either candidate could certainly win the state of Nevada. This is most certainly a very competitive race. Right now, however, simply according to polling, Nevada is in the tilt blue column. Now we go to the state of Arizona. Arizona is a trending blue state. However, in the current polling, as you can see, Donald Trump holds a 1.6% advantage over Kamala Harris. Harris has only been leading in one poll, while one poll conducted by CNN, suggests that Donald Trump is actually up by 5% in the state of Arizona. Now that should be a good sign for the former president, who actually lost the state to Joe Biden in 2020 by a margin of 12,000 votes. If Donald Trump is able to win the state, that will be a huge flip, and that could bode well for Donald Trump in some of the suburban areas, which is what the state of Arizona is filled with. So as of right now, Arizona goes down as tilt Republican. Next up, we just go to some of the Great Plains states that really won't make a splash, but could indicate how the rural areas will be voting. First off, in the state of Idaho, we don't have any polls, but it's safe to say that this is a safe Republican race. We now go to the state of Utah, where there's quite a spread. You can see a Trump plus 10 poll and a Trump plus 32 poll. Now, generally in the state of Utah, polls do underestimate Donald Trump, which is probably a good thing for Trump that he's already leading by such a significant margin, and we're going to give Utah a safe Republican. We now go to the state of Wyoming, where Trump is leading in the one poll conducted there by 53%. With an apples to apples comparison, Trump only won the state by 43% in 2020, which would be a significant increase for him, especially in a state as rural as this and as lopsided for Trump as it is already. Now, that could indicate strength in the rural areas, but I'm not going to infer too much from this, safe Republican. Now we go to the state of Montana, where Trump is up by 17.6%, according to RCP. Now that is a marginal increase from 16.4% in 2020. So right now Montana is safe Republican. We go to the next state here, South Dakota. This is roughly in line with the actual results in South Dakota. Trump is underperforming slightly, but then do keep into consideration that polls generally underestimate Donald Trump by a couple of points. Now going to the state of North Dakota here, where Trump is also leading by a roughly similar margin as he was in 2020. So that state also goes to the Republican Party. Now we go to the state of Nebraska, where there's a little bit more nuance, where the second district is slightly competitive. If you look at the one poll conducted between Harris and Trump, actually there's 3 polls, but nevertheless, Harris is up by roughly 6%, which would be indicative of a likely margin. Now, if you're curious of how the statewide vote looks like, if you look at all, essentially Trump is still up by a significant margin. Trump plus 19, Trump plus 17. So as of right now, this certainly is still a safe Republican state. Now going to the state of Colorado. Now, in the few polls that were conducted in Colorado, these were not polls conducted between Harris and Trump. Rather, these are polls conducted between Biden and Trump, and Biden was only up by 6.5%. Not the most impressive when he won the state by 13.5 just 4 years ago. That could indicate some slippage from the Democratic Party in some of these suburban voters. But I shouldn't infer too much about this because now this race is between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and not Biden versus Trump. Nevertheless, here Colorado goes down as likely. Now we go to the state of New Mexico, where in the one conducted between Harris and Trump, Harris is up by 10%. That's a slight reduction from a 10.8% margin, but nevertheless a pretty solid victory for Kamala Harris. Now next up, going to the state of Alaska, which is notoriously difficult to poll because it's so far from the mainland United States. Nevertheless, right now in the state of Alaska, in the poll conducted between Harris and Trump, Trump has a 10% advantage. That is identical to the 2020 margin, so Alaska does go down as likely a Republican. Now going to Hawaii here, there are not any head-to-head polls between Harris and Trump, which means that there is no apples-to-apples comparison. Nevertheless, Trump versus Biden was only up by 8 and 18%, not the most respectable for a candidate who won the state by 28%, back in 2020. So that state is going to go to the safe blue margin, but that's not something Democrats should be bragging about. Now going next here to the state of Oklahoma. In the state of Oklahoma right now, Donald Trump does hold a 16% lead in the one poll conducted between him and Harris, which is a drop off from the 2020 margin, but then again, some of these polls are not super accurate. Now going to the state of Texas. Texas is an interesting state. It's a very populated state that used to be heavily Republican, and now it's more competitive. Nevertheless, here Trump still maintains a 7.3% advantage, although that may seem narrow. That is more than the 5.6% advantage he held over Joe Biden in 2020. And considering that Texas is a trending Republican state, if he's able to overperform there compared to 2020, that does bode well for him in the remainder of the United States. Nevertheless, Texas is a likely Republican state. Now going to Louisiana, where we see Trump is slightly underperforming, but yet again, this is not a apples-to-apples comparison, where it's Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, and not Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Anyways, Louisiana is safe Republican. Next up, we go to the state of Kansas, where again the margins remain similar between the polls and the actual 2020 presidential election results. Though it's notable here that again, there's no Trump versus Harris polls here. Nevertheless, Trump maintains roughly a 15% margin, which is safe Republican. Now we go to Arkansas, where again we don't have an apples-to-apples comparison, but in the two polls between Biden and Trump, Biden has roughly a 28% deficit. If you compare it to the actual results, that is quite similar. So we do see a safe Republican characterization. Now we go to the state of Missouri, where again we have two polls conducted between Trump and Harris. When you average these numbers out, that is roughly a 15.5% margin in favor of Donald Trump. And when you look at the actual results here, Trump won the state by 15.4%. So again, quite a similar result based on the two polls that were conducted. Now going to the state of Iowa here, where Trump is overperforming, but this is again against Joe Biden. It's not against Kamala Harris. Nevertheless, Trump is expected to do better than where he was performing in 2020, and right now Trump has an average of about a 13 to 14% advantage. That means that he will win the state by a safe margin, at least according to polling. Now, as you can see, both candidates are well over 100 electoral college votes right now. Harris at exactly 100 and Donald Trump at 124. And Illinois will give a boost for Kamala Harris. She is leading there by 16%. Again, that is similar to the 2020 numbers, where Biden won the state by 17. So that does go to Kamala Harris. Now we're going to go into some of the other states here. So starting with the state of Indiana. The one poll that was conducted between Harris and Trump in the state shows Trump up by 10% against Kamala Harris. However, this is sponsored by a Democratic candidate for office, so it's not necessarily the most credible pollster. Right now, if you look at the results in 2020, that would be a 6% underperformance, but again, this poll does not seem to be very reliable. So the state of Indiana does go down as likely Republican, though with a caveat. Now going to the state of Tennessee. If you look at the state of Tennessee right now, you can see that Trump is up by 26% in the one poll against Kamala Harris with 0 undecideds. That's a 3% overperformance from the 2020 numbers for Donald Trump. Tennessee is of course safe Republican. Now we go to the state of Mississippi, where there's one poll conducted between Biden and Trump showing Trump up by 18, which is again a slight overperformance from 2020, where Trump won the state by 16.5%. Nevertheless, here nothing significant, Mississippi a safe Republican. We now go to the next state here, the state of Alabama. Alabama, in the 3 polls conducted between Trump and Biden, Trump had a 21% advantage. Now that is around the actual margin where Trump actually won it by. Trump won it by a little bit more, 25.5%, but nevertheless Alabama is a safe Republican state. Finally, we go to the state of West Virginia here. In the state of West Virginia, in the one poll conducted between Harris and Trump, Harris has a 27% deficit. Now that is not close to the 40% actual deficit that Trump gained over Joe Biden in 2020. However, it's important to note that there's a lot of ancestral Democrats from West Virginia who are unwilling to admit that they're going to vote for Trump, but they're going to go for the Republican candidate nonetheless. So West Virginia is safe Republican. Now that does give Donald Trump a boost to 165 electoral college votes to Kamala Harris at 119. Now next up, going to the state of Kentucky. In the state of Kentucky, we don't have any head-to-head polls between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Nevertheless, Trump has a 25% advantage over Joe Biden, which is roughly the same as it was in 2020. So the state of Kentucky does go to the Republican Party. Now going to the state of Florida. Now, Florida was a state that was really competitive in 2020, going for Trump by 3.4%. However, this time, Donald Trump is expected to have a much easier race and win it by 6. Now, may seem to still be a relatively competitive race, but do keep into consideration the fact that Joe Biden was actually leading at this point in the state of Florida back in 2020. And obviously, he ended up losing the state by 3.something%, which means that the polls were actually outside the margin of error. When you adjust that for the margin of error, then Trump would be winning by double digits. Nevertheless, here, this is just a polling video. This is going to be a R+6 state. Now going to the state of Georgia. Georgia polls have historically been quite accurate, and this time it's showing a dead heat, with Donald Trump up by 0.3% over Kamala Harris. Now, the polling I've generally noticed in the state of Georgia is that it overestimates Joe Biden, or a Democratic candidate by roughly around 1%, or it's really accurate. In 2020, the final polls in the state of Georgia overestimated Joe Biden by 1%. 2016, it overestimated Hillary Clinton by 1%. So when you adjust it for that, Trump will win it by a very narrow margin. And right now, Trump is still leading, so it's going to be a very competitive race. But I do believe that Donald Trump, along with the polling, is nearly favored to win the state of Georgia. Now going to the state of South Carolina. Now, in the state of South Carolina, we don't have any head-to-head polling, but the polls conducted between Trump and Biden suggested that Trump was up by around 16%. If you look at that, that is a overperformance, but again, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison because Joe Biden is not even on the ballot anymore, so the state of South Carolina does go for the Republican Party by a safe margin. Now, if you look at this, Donald Trump is already at 228 electoral college votes, and he has already flipped 2 Biden states, the states of Arizona and Georgia, 2 states that went for Biden by a combined total of 23,000 votes. Now going to the state of North Carolina. This is the one state that Harris has been targeting as the so-called red state. This has not been a state that has voted for a Democratic candidate since Barack Obama in 2008 on the presidential level. Now, if you look at polling right now, you might see that Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are essentially neck and neck. However, do keep in mind that the state of North Carolina generally polls in North Carolina consistently overestimate the Democratic Party. In 2020, Joe Biden had around a 3% lead here on FiveThirtyEight before losing the state subsequently by about 1.3%. So as you can imagine, the state of North Carolina will probably go for Donald Trump, something that the polls, myself, and most pundits can agree with. So North Carolina now in its Republican column, boosting Trump up to 244 electoral college votes. Now next up in the state of Ohio. Currently in the state of Ohio, Donald Trump maintains a 9% lead over Kamala Harris. Now that might seem pretty similar to 2020, where Donald Trump won the state over Joe Biden by 8 points. However, in the state of Ohio, polls are notorious for overestimating Democratic candidates. Both Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton at this point in time in the election was actually leading in the state of Ohio on its polling aggregate before subsequently losing the state by 8% in both elections. That's roughly a 10% underestimation of Donald Trump. Now, if you consider that, that means Trump is actually up by 18%. However, this is just a polling video, so the state of Ohio does come down as likely Republican. See here, Donald Trump is actually up against Kamala Harris on the electoral vote count by 142 electoral college votes. Now, Kamala Harris will get her much needed boost in New England. So, starting off here from the state of Virginia. Now, Virginia at this point in time seems to be the most polled state of this entire election cycle, which is quite interesting. Harris does lead by 5.3%. However, this is not good news for the Harris campaign. Joe Biden won the state by double digits, and polling the state actually overestimated Joe Biden in the final results. Now, that is certainly a concerning sign because if Harris is only winning the state by 5% or less, that could signify that she's not doing that well in the Arlington suburbs around Washington, D.C., which could spell trouble elsewhere in a state like Pennsylvania, Georgia, or Arizona. Now, don't read too much into this, but that's not a good sign for the Harris campaign. Virginia is barely likely for the Democratic Party. Now, D.C., there's no polls there. Delaware, there's no polls there. In the state of Maryland, we do have some polls between Harris and and Donald Trump. Now, the few polls that were taken, it does seem like that Harris is underperforming Biden's number. She's leading from anywhere ranging between 20 points and 32%, which in any case is still under Biden's 33.2% victory. So the state of Maryland does go for the Democratic Party, albeit not by the best of all margins that Democrat would hope for. Now in New Jersey, we don't have any polls, but if you look at some of these numbers, it's really concerning for the Democratic Party. This was a state that Joe Biden won by a safe margin back in 2020, and right now, at least from the Joe Biden versus Donald Trump polls, the state of New Jersey is competitive. And because this is a polling video, that's why I'm going to keep it as a lean Democratic state. Now going to the state of Connecticut. Now in the state of Connecticut right now, there's again not many very effective polling, but as you can see right now, Joe Biden's up by roughly 12%, which is a likely margin according to my map. Not the best when Joe Biden won the state by 20% over Donald Trump in 2020. Now going to the state of Rhode Island here, where again there's not a lot of polls, but nevertheless here you do see that Joe Biden's up by roughly 15%. Not the best margin, where again, Joe Biden actually won the state by 21% over Donald Trump in the actual election results. So that is still a win for Kamala Harris, just not by as good of a margin. Finally, going to the state of New York. Now, New York, the Empire State, is not a state where Donald Trump is expected to win. However, polling there has shown a surprisingly tight race, with Kamala Harris only up by roughly 13% when you average her polls out. That is a 10% reduction from Biden's 23% victory in the state of New York back in 2020. That could spell trouble for a Democratic Party who's trying to flip a bunch of House races in the New York area, especially in Long Island, Staten Island, as well as some of the areas around Westchester County. Now, this could signify the fact that Democrats are somewhat disaffected, and this could be a troubling sign for Democrats nationwide in states that have a similar demographic as the state of New York, specifically with minority voters who seem disengaged with this year's general election. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. New York is still safe blue, albeit not by the most impressive margin or the margin that Democrats would hope for. Now we're going to continue off with some of the more liberal states in the north, starting here with the state of Massachusetts. In Massachusetts right now, Democrats have a significant advantage, which is still slightly under the 33.5% margin they had over Donald Trump in 2020, but nevertheless, this is still a margin of victory for the Democratic Party. Going to the state of Vermont here, you can see that the two polls conducted has Harris up by 40%, which is not all that realistic. I don't think it's going to be that blue, but nevertheless, the state of Vermont is going to go safe for the Democratic Party. Now going to the state of New Hampshire. In the state of New Hampshire here right now, Harris has roughly a 6.6% advantage over Donald Trump. That is a slight reduction from 2020, but nevertheless still a pretty solid margin for Kamala Harris if you do trust the polls. Now do keep in mind that in 2020, polls had Joe Biden up by 13% in the state over Donald Trump. So if those polls end up being wrong again, this would essentially be a coin flip election. But this is just a video based on the polling. Finally, going to the state of Maine. If you look at the state of Maine right now, the 1st district is obviously going to go blue. Now, the Maine at-large vote has been somewhat in dispute. The most recent poll has it as D plus 17. Another poll, Harris plus 9. This one had Trump plus 1, so it's pretty complicated. But in the 2 polls that have Harris featured in them, it does seem like that Harris has a lead, and the state of Maine does go as likely Democratic, while the 2nd district does go as likely Republican, because this is a more rural district and working class, an area that Donald Trump generally performs quite well in. Now, next up, going to the 4 states that really will determine who wins the election: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, especially the latter 3 states. First off, in Minnesota, Harris has a 5.5% advantage, which is less than Joe Biden's 7.1% advantage in 2020, which is noticeable considering that her running mate, Tim Walz, is actually the governor of Minnesota. You probably would expect a better margin for her if she was actually going to win the presidency. Now, going to the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin polling has historically been a disaster. Joe Biden was up by 6.3% at this moment on the election cycle, and Biden was actually up by 8.4% on election day on 5/38, before subsequently winning the state by less than 1%. So Wisconsin polling has historically not been the most accurate. In fact, if you look at this Bloomberg poll, you can tell exactly why. Regardless if you're a Democrat or Republican, support Harris, support Trump, or if you think Harris or Trump will win the presidency, I think no one disputes the fact that Harris will not win the state of Wisconsin by an 8% margin. That just shows a response error. Nevertheless, here this is a polling video, so Wisconsin will have to go to Democrat, although I definitely disagree with these polls because they have historically been really bad, especially in Wisconsin, where polls in 2016 and 2020 were off by at least 6% in favor of Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. Now we go to the state of Michigan, and Michigan is somehow more competitive than the state of Wisconsin, or at least more favorable for the Republicans. That doesn't make sense. Now, I think this number more or less does make sense, but if you look at this number, I'd say that that doesn't make sense, and that this certainly doesn't make sense to me, because Wisconsin has historically been more Republican leaning than the state of Michigan. Now, Michigan, as you can see, still overestimated the Democratic support in 2016 and 2020 by wide margins. But at this point, you're going to see the state of Michigan in the tilt blue column. Finally, in Pennsylvania. And boy, Pennsylvania is a state that generally polls are not as off as the states of Wisconsin and Michigan, and shows a dead heat. Thanks to this, again, this Bloomberg poll, which kind of skews the average. Generally, all the other polls fall between a tie and a Trump plus 2, but this is a Harris plus 4 poll, which is kind of a outlier. Nevertheless, here, I do still have to trust the polling aggregate, at least for this video, although I don't actually trust it in real life. As you can see, it overestimated Joe Biden by 3% in 2020 and overestimated Clinton by 7% in 2016. But we're going to look at Polymarket. Polymarket is where people actually bet their money to see who is going to win the presidential election, or essentially on many different things, who is going to win the NFL, etc. And right now, Republicans have a 51% chance of winning, while Democrats have a 50% chance of winning. In other words, it's very competitive, but nevertheless, this is a very much a 50-50 type of result. So as you can see right now, this is a very competitive election, but at least because I don't want to leave any state as a toss-up, we're going to put the state of Pennsylvania in the tilt Republican column, giving Donald Trump 281 and Harris 257. Now, if you look at this map, you see a very competitive election. However, do keep in mind that polling is not something I generally trust. At least I wouldn't trust it without a huge grain of salt. Polls consistently overestimate the Democratic Party, at least against Donald Trump. Polls overestimated the Democratic Party by roughly 2% in 16 and 4% in 20. And in the states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, polls were off by far greater margins than those margins I just mentioned. In Wisconsin, both 2016 and 2020, the Democratic Party was overestimated by more than 8%. Some of these polling errors are simply unacceptable. And frankly, if you look at some of these polls from an adjusted perspective, you will see the Republicans winning far more electoral college votes. Anyways, if you want to see a video where the polls are actually wrong, you can click here. And if you want to subscribe, click here. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.